Good day, everyone, and welcome to our Humor book launch series. My name is Minenhle Ngube. I'm a doctoral fellow at Humor. Please note that this session is being recorded on the Zoom live stream and is being live streamed onto our Facebook page. Our Humor book launch is a forum of acknowledgement and critical engagement of work that's being produced in or on the African continent, especially relevant to Humor's research agenda. It's a space of critical discussion of some selected books with invited authors and presented to an audience and in discussion with relevant discussant. Today, we are presenting a book by Professor Majid Hannoum he's a professor of anthropology at the University of Kansas. He's the editor of Practicing Sufism. He's also an author of The Invention of the Maghreb Between Africa and the Middle East. He has also authored Living, Tangier, Migration, Race and Illegality in a Moroccan City and other relevant and important works. He's a researcher at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, a fellow at the Center of Middle Eastern Study at Harvard, a visiting scholar in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University, a senior Fulbright fellow and a senior fellow at the Aga Khan Center in London. His book that we're discussing is called The Invention of the Maghreb Between Africa and the Middle East, and it's a book that discusses colonial French rule in the region of the Maghreb. And today he's joined by his discussant, who is also our fellow, doctoral fellow at Humor, Nabil Fedaosi. Nabil is one of our fellows who has a bachelor's in English literary studies and master's degree in cultural studies at the University of Sidi in Morocco. He's worked as a research assistant at the Danish Institute for International Studies. He serves as an editorial assistant at IREMAM, and he's doing his PhD, which is examining cultural anthropology of migration and borders. And we're very excited to be discussing this work. Professor Hannoum, you're welcome to speak about your book for the first 20 minutes of the time, followed by Nabil's engagement in the next 20 minutes and a Q&A thereafter. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for this generous presentation. It's a privilege for me to be here and to talk to you, especially that the event is taking place in Africa itself. So I understand that you are in Cape Town. I'm in Tangier. So I would like to talk about my book as a question. So the first thing that I should say is that the argument of the book is quite obvious and it's quite simple as well. It's quite obvious because it's in the title, the title says Invention of the Maghreb Between Africa and the Middle East. And it's quite simple because the Maghreb is an invention that happens in a specific time that I trace in the book. And it happens at the same time as two other inventions, the invention of Africa and the invention of the Middle East. And all of this happens pretty much like 19th century, throughout the 19th century, or at least throughout the first half of the 20th century and first couple of decades of the 20th century. So I say that the argument is quite simple, yet at the same time, I did notice that people react to it. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, oftentimes with disbelief, because they would say, how come, like the Maghreb has always existed? Or they would react rather to the concept of invention that they most probably understand as falsification or fabrication or something that's really not real, it's just made up. So I'm going to clarify these two concepts, the Maghreb and the concept invention, in order to show you that, really in order to convey to you how simple the argument is. The argument is simple, but in my view, it's the demonstration of the point that's very complex and maybe very interesting for historians and for anthropologists. So to start, I should say that the Maghreb, the term, did not exist before 1927. No, you can't find it in French. It's impossible. There are times, especially throughout the 19th century, 1840s, you find Maghreb, and you find it in publications of members of the Exploration Scientifique de l'Algérie. But you find it in italics. So it's really not Maghreb, it's Maghreb. And it's in italics. Italics indicate that the term was foreign and it was not part of the French language. So when you also look at these publications of Exploration Scientifique de l'Algérie, you notice that like usually the term is used when there's a translation. And of course, one of the books that was translated at that time was the history of Africa and the Maghreb, you know, the Qayrawani. His name is Ibn Rafiq Qayrawani. That's the 11th century. So, but the French themselves did not adopt that term. Again, like once again, the term did not exist before 1827. It existed from 1927 onwards. Before that, you have few names. Throughout the 19th century, pretty much, you have few names that refer to the region in a way that's not really clear and, you know, and specific. There is, of course, the first term that you find is the term Afrique, really to designate the entirety of what we call today North Africa minus Egypt. You find another term, which is l'Afrique française, really to designate specifically countries that were under French occupation. And of course, this name excludes Egypt and it excludes Libya. You find another term, which is l'Afrique latine. And that's basically like in the specific countries that were under Roman occupation. And that, of course, I mean, it does include, it does exclude Libya. But the Afrique latine meant specifically to include like Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. So those are the names that you find pretty much like before. Of course, you find the term l'Afrique française, and also it designates that same area that you just mentioned now. You find another term by 1871. Another term came up, which is l'Afrique septentrionale, with the publication of Ernest Mercier's book, Histoire de l'établissement des Arabes dans l'Afrique septentrionale. Those are the terms that you find in the 19th century. The term North Africa came up from time to time, but there was no term that was really dominant. As a matter of fact, there was a time when another term came up, also like around 1850s, that became quite current, and that's the term Berberi. Okay? Not to confuse with the term barbarie that was used from the 16th century to the 17th century, you know, especially in European cartography. Okay, so again, like the idea here must be, or at least should be clear, that the term Maghreb, you know, is an invention in the sense that it existed. It was invented within French language only, you know, from 1827. From 1927 onwards. Okay. So now, someone may say, okay, I mean, Maghreb is an Arabic name, it means the region, so it couldn't possibly be an invention. French just, you know, adopted an Arabic name. Well, the term Maghreb, it does not designate Maghreb. Maghreb in Arabic, it means Morocco. You know, that's what it means. Now, before French colonial rule in Algeria, you have like specific terms that were used in the regions, and one of them was like Al-Maghreb al-Aqsa, that corresponded, all things considered, to Morocco. Al-Maghreb al-Awsat, that corresponded, all things considered, to Tunisia, and Al-Maghreb al-Adna, Al-Maghreb al-Awsat to Algeria, and Al-Maghreb al-Adna, that corresponded, again, all things considered, to Tunisia. So those are not Maghreb, you know. the Maghreb, which includes, as Google would say, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, is something new, even in Arabic. There has never been in the history of the region a region that's called Maghreb that's included Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Okay. What you do have, like in early on, like by the time of the Arab conquest, you do have the term Ifriqiya that included the entirety of the region, and Egypt was part of it. Okay, there's a book, for instance, by Ibn Abd al-Hakam. It's called Futuh al-Maghrib, Futuh Ifriqiya wal-Andalus. And by that, he means really like from Egypt onwards, all the way to Morocco. Al-Andalus was something different, At one point, like the term Ifriqiya appeared again, pretty much it appeared around the same time to designate the entirety of the region, that includes also Egypt. Ibn al-Raqiq says Ifriqiya, includes a part of Egypt. So it's very difficult to really kind of translate the geography of that time to our language today. But there's part of Egypt. Libya was definitively part of it, all the way to Morocco. Okay, but at that, by the time of Ibn al-Raqiq in the 11th century, you really have a clear distinction between Ifriqiya and Maghreb. So you have like two entities within this entity that today we call the Maghreb. So the terms again, like they have changed, like within Islamic history. The Maghreb included sometimes Egypt, or at least part of Egypt. Sometimes it included half of the region, and the other half was called Ifriqiya. Maghreb also, there are times when it's included in the region itself. There are many times, as a matter of fact, when it included parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so you can see that the configurations of the region has been changing all the time, which is normal. I mean, things change all the time. But to kind of like think about a region that includes Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, called a Maghreb in French, that also it's echo within European languages, is something very, very new. As a matter of fact, when I say very new, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, it's an invention, okay? Now, there's another term that people may say, oh, like, Maghreb is like a Maghreb al-Arabi. Maghreb al-Arabi has never existed at all, actually, before 1940. There is nowhere in the history of, historiography where you find something called al-Maghreb al-Arabi. It's something that came out in the 1940s. As a matter of fact, as a reaction, the very concept of the Maghreb that was invented in 1927, 28. But I should make it clear here that even though the name is very important, because the name is not only an index, it's not only something that refers to something. Behind the name, you have always two things. You have a perception, in our case, behind the name, you have narratives, you have all kinds of stories, all kinds of even discourses, as a matter of fact, that substantiate, something called the Maghreb. As a matter of fact, when I say substantiate, I also mean create, okay? Something called the Maghreb. And then there is something else behind, that name, which is basically power, the power to make that name meaningful, to make those kind of like conceptions, those narratives, very powerful in such a way as they appear true. Okay, and in case of the Maghreb, not only Maghreb appears true, but appears self-evident. So, and it was exactly this self-evidence of the not only the name, but like the conception that we have of the Maghreb that they want to to trace and to deconstruct. So again, behind the name, you have like narratives. I argue in the book that these narratives were also like new narratives. As a matter of fact, they were modern narratives. They were narratives that were created by highly, powerful technologies of power, of the power of colonial modernity. And therefore, what we really have, like in addition to historiographic discourse that claims to be scientific, because remember, in the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, history was considered like a science, okay? Especially in its phase of positivism, that the historical discourse was a scientific discourse. And then, of course, I mean, the historical discourse at that time was not what it is today. I mean, it was part of the historical discourse was exactly, the archaeological discourse that really gives like evidence to the historical discourse. And then you have, of course, like anthropology, you have ethnography, you have racial theories, you have linguistics, and so forth. So all those things, they have been combined like by the colonial states to really create a conception of the Maghreb. Let me just make sure, that at least one thing is clear. I do not mean by this that like French colonials were sitting somewhere conspiring, trying to create something. No. I mean, what really has happened was French arrived to a land about which they didn't know really that much. So therefore, they were trying to figure it out. And in doing so, they created their own comprehension of the Maghreb, what the Maghreb is, and this comprehension was guided by their own categories of thoughts. They have specific categories by which they can comprehend something so foreign and so unknown. So therefore, one of the most important categories that was introduced in the very construction of the Maghreb is precisely the concept of race, the population. And you find that like in Ibn Khaldun, for instance, which is like one of the major sources of French historians. When you read Ibn Khaldun in Arabic, there is no concept of race. It simply doesn't exist. Ibn Khaldun used other concepts that are specific to the 14th century. The most common one of them is the tribe, Qabila, and the other one is al-jil, which we can translate somehow with generation, but it has a specific meaning, like when he says al-jil awwal al-arab, al-jil thani lil-barbar, al-jil thalith, etc. Sorry, but like the French, like they could not. I mean, like those are concepts that were so foreign to them, they could not even understand them. Therefore, they came up with their own concept to kind of like understand, not only the region that they were trying to figure out, but also the sources that were at their disposal. So they would translate like G as, a race. And therefore you really have another construction of the population, of the entirety of the population of this thing that was created, that's called Maghreb, as composed mainly, if not really exclusively, of two races, like Arabs and Berbers, okay? These two races are antagonistic, they don't like each other. As a matter of fact, there's a relation of dominated between them, but also these two called races, they are defined not only in relation of antagonism to each other, but also in relation to inferiority towards the Aryan race, as a matter of fact, towards French. So therefore, like what you really have, like an entire, a conception of what the population was made of, what its history, okay, what its type of Islam, and so what are its languages, and how are they different from whatever language existed at the border between, let's say, Senegal and Maghreb, or between Mali and Maghreb, or between Tunisia and Maghreb, the Middle East. So that's basically what I try to do. It's really not only the name is like an easy thing to, to demonstrate, but the conception itself, that this is something very, very new, to show that there was a conception that was done like gradually, little by little, without really kind of like the French colonials being acutely aware of the fact that they were constructing something. But let me just also make something clear. What was done in so-called Maghreb was done in France itself, meaning like France itself was invented precisely by its same technologies of power before the colonies, went through, the same process of invention. So I should stop there, and I would be happy to answer any questions or discussions, or, etc. Thank you.
you, Professor Hannoum, for elaborating on the terminology of Maghreb, that overview. And I'd like to ask Nabil if he's available for an intervention at this stage.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Professor Abdelmajid Hannoum, for your wonderful presentation of the book. And it's strikingly deconstructive when it comes to the concept of the Maghreb. I like how the book actually tries to deconstruct the various conceptions that try to pin down or to the geographical limits of the region that is called nowadays as the Maghreb, with different appellations which are colonial and supported by these inventories of power technologies that he mentioned in the book, including print machines and education and different institutions that he mentioned in the book. It's quite intriguing to see how a deconstruction of the concept of the Maghreb, how can we reconstruct the region, or how can we provide a cartographic narratives that are more politically salient nowadays, especially taking into consideration the different political needs of the region vis-a-vis traditional allies and also African allies. I'm also taking cue from your interest in Tangier and in the migratory corridor, and how Morocco itself, it's called Maghreb, and how it is constructed as an immigration nation, as something of recent invention, especially with the Nouvelle Politique Migratoire that reconstructs Morocco as a new immigration nation that hosts African migrants into the country through regularization campaigns. But also it's the same thing, the same trope being reiterated, this construction of narratives as an immigration nation. But in fact, Morocco has been a crossroads of several mobilities since the Arab conquest, trans-Saharan slave trade, and everything else. So these we should be acutely attuned to these constructions and their teleologies in various ways. Thank you so much. And I see that we have so many questions in the chat box, and I'm sure that many other scholars are joining us from Morocco. I see many names, and I'm very glad to see them here, and to look forward to their own discussion and what they think of your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nabil. Thank you, Professor. And speaking of questions, in the chat we have, I noticed a question from Amira. Are you comfortable to start your video and pose your question, Amira?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for the for introducing the book to us, and I find it really interesting. I myself, Amira bin Abdel Qadir, I'm a doctor in applied linguistics, and I'm so interested in anthropology and sociology in my region. So my question was, when you said that we can't assume that there is such a conspiracy by the French, and they were just trying to have an understanding of the region. So my question is, were they really trying to get an understanding or create one, or are they imposing their own understanding on the region? Because they were coming violently, and so we know the history. So what do you think? Were they imposing or trying to create one?
We have to distinguish between two things, when it comes to this very history of the invention of the Maghreb. We can I can also say that, like, what I'm going to say also applies to all the cultural production that happened during the colonial period. And the distinction that we should make is there is distinction between the institutions that produced what we call knowledge, and those institutions I mentioned some of them earlier, Exploration Scientifique d'Algérie, but also les Bureaux Arabes, also l'École d'Alger and l'École de Rabat. Those were like the most important, like, the institutions. And then you have the, political institutions that decide, which representation fits the interest of the colonial state and which one does not. So there are two things. I mean, like, the separation between them is not, of course, like, a clear-cut separation. I mean, like, we know that there were like officers in the army that had really very important political role, and they were like professors at the University of Alger, Faculté des Lettres d'Alger, or l'École des Hautes Études de Rabat, that also like had like very, very important role. But the distinction should at least be made theoretically, so we can know what's going on. What's going on is far away. I mean, like, you have a variety of representations, but the colonial state, meaning state institutions, they usually favor representations that fit best or serve best the colonial interest. And I will just give you an example. There were two representations about the population. Three, as a matter of fact. The third one is the one that's going to become true and dominant and important and official, and it's still with us today. The first representation is that the population, in the case of Algeria, was diverse. It was not just made of Arabs and Berbers. As a matter of fact, it was made of Arabs and Berbers and Arabized and Berberized population. It was also made of Congolese, a population who were mixed from Arabs and Turks. It was made also of Turks. It was made of blacks. It was made of blacks who were mixed with Arabs. And it was made of Jews. Some of them were like Berber Jews, or at least that they were Berber Jews. Some of them were Jewish Jews, so to speak, or at least they believed so. So this is like a very complex representation that you find sometimes in the work of really some very serious scholars, such as even what's his name, Tocqueville, or Verbrugger. So, or what's his name, the Ismail Urban. So you have like a different representation, but then you have other representation that says, Arabs and Berbers are Berbers, and the relation between them is really one of antagonism. This is the one that states, the colonial states favor, because it was very, very important for the colonial state. That was in Algeria, but it was also extended to, to Morocco. It was very important that there's a serious, fracture within, the colonized society that would prevent any type of unity that would challenge the colonial state. This happened especially like at the time of Abdelkader in the 1830s, when at one point, like the Kabyle, did not, or at least a good number of them, did not see themselves in the cause of Abdelkader, because the concept of nation was a little bit alien to them. I mean, what they saw was like their own territory that was still independent. It was still not colonized by the French. So they had no business to do with Abdelkader whatsoever. Whereas Sharia was really like, that was like the area that was like fully, colonized. So this division, the colonial state became aware of the fact that it's extremely beneficial. So it's favored, So again, what I'm saying is that like you have different representations, but you have like specific ones that serve the colonial states that are always like favored, So that's basically what you can find in this history of representation. Now, you mentioned ideology. I mean, like any discourse is ideological. Ideology with, its definition, and Tosserian definition, is like a system of ideas that has social historical, function. Any discourse, including the one I'm trying to elaborate right now, does that. Okay, so it's not that like there was like a representation that was not ideological and one that was ideological. No, it's just the representation that serve states at that moment are favored. It happens that sometimes state abandons a representation that's no longer useful. And I will give you another example again from Algeria. In 1870, the Kabyle this time revolted against the French state. Okay, they revolted. The land was occupied 2 decades ago, and they were subjected to a very repressive and violent practices from the colonial state. So they revolted. Well, if you look at like the representation of the Kabyle immediately after that period, they became Arabs. You have like this new discourse that says basically that like the Berbers or Kabyles, including the Kabyles, are Arabs, originally Arabs, or else how would you extend your hostility towards the colonial state? So this is basically some of the answers I have for your question. So there's another.
Yeah, I mean, if I may interrupt, well, thank you so much for your.
Yeah.
So the categorization, let's say, or the invention of Maghreb and Kabyle and Arab and all those like entities, even though they are fixed, like in their own sense, if we take them like abstractly, they are abstract entities, they are fixed and with boundaries and so on. But then when we look at history and how we dealt with them with flexibility, like you said. So the Kabyles, at first they were enclosed, they didn't accept the idea of nation with the Emir Abdul Qadir and so on, but then they thought, oh, this is our land, we have to fight. So I guess this goes also with the notion of the name or the label of Maghreb, and then the Arab Maghreb. We know that at some point we started those Arabization movements, and we also tried to create unions as post-colonial nations. So, do you think that label of Arab, despite that the resistance from the Shawis, the Kabyles, and all the Amazigh groups, we still use them? Actually, when I had the history subject in primary school and secondary school and so on, we had that notion of the Arab Maghreb, and we actually included even Mauritania and Libya. So all those speaking Arabic, they were included in the Arab Maghreb. So don't you think that it's a reaction? It's a kind of an anti-colonial reaction, or what is it?
Yeah. I would just like try to correct, if I may, something that you said earlier about the categories that are fixed. They are not. I mean, even in the colonial discourse, they are not. The word Kabyle, that we believe it's so fixed, that the first people to believe it's so fixed are the Kabyle themselves. It was used throughout the 18th century to designate the entire so-called Berber population that live in the mountains, including Morocco. As a matter of fact, initially it was applied by the Paradis, ethnographer, historian, linguist, to the entirety of so-called Arab Berber population that live in the mountains, not the ones that live somewhere else. So now, what you said brings a very, very important point that somehow, like in my presentation, I didn't go to, which is the fact that like the colonial discourse, when it was constructed, like in a very hegemonic way, it imposed itself on the colonized, and that's really like it's an effect of power. So you have this construction that was so important, again, because behind us, there's the entirety of, of French modernity and its weight. Okay, so the colonized in this specific case is Salafi, what later on they call themselves, or they are called Muslim reformists, Ibn Badis and his group.
Yeah.
They could not ignore the discourse, the colonial discourse. It was just impossible to ignore it. And they were right, because you cannot ignore, what states, the colonial state says about you, because what it says about you affects your daily life. It affects your political position within society itself. You cannot ignore it. Why? We saw that because like the code L'Indigène, which is like one of the most racist, if not the most racist code that you compare to apartheid, apartheid would pay compared to code L'Indigène. So that code had its own justification in precisely this colonial representation. So the Salafi ulama could not ignore the discourse. It's just impossible. So they had to react to it, meaning they had to critique it, they have to try to kind of dismantle it and so forth. And that's exactly the problem. I mean, it's created another problem. It's a catch-22, like, you lose if you do, you lose if you don't. By responding to it, you reproduce the logic of the colonial discourse. You reproduce the categories of the colonial discourse, and you cannot not do. Even when you reproduce it negatively, I mean, let me just give you an example. The dominant colonial discourse says the area is made of Arabs and Berbers and they hate each other. Okay, because that's what race is. It's about like two groups that are different in the way they look, the way they speak. But not only that, there's also this serious antagonism between the two. They cannot possibly coexist. So when the Salafi ulama react to that, they bring like a negative truth to face the colonial discourse. Basically, what they say is, using Ibn Khaldun especially, they say that, well, I mean, the Berbers are Arabs, and then they would give evidence from historiography from Ibn Khaldun himself that supposedly said that the Berbers are originally from Arab. So that response itself is so problematic, because what they have done was reproduce the category of Arab and Berbers as race. So like that's something that it gets kind of like inserted in the so-called native discourse. And that insertion itself means that like the colonial discourse got into your own. And therefore, you reproduce some of its truth, you reproduce negatively, as I said, with Arabs and Berbers. But some most important ones, you are not aware of the fact that you reproduce them, okay? Because like they are kind of invisible, such as the concept of race. So now, it's at that moment that they came up with the idea of Al-Maghreb al-Arabi. Why Al-Maghreb al-Arabi? Because in the colonial discourse, in the dominant colonial discourse, the Maghreb was exactly the same Maghreb that they called Berberi. And some of the great, very respectful historians, such as Brunswick, 1946, the region was still called Berberi. Okay. As a matter of fact, one of the contemporary authors commenting on my book, with Jeune Afrique, that he didn't read, he said, well, like the region is called Berberi. It's not called Berberi, it's called Maghreb, But in Arabic, it's called Maghreb al-Arabi. So Al-Maghreb al-Arabi itself, so like when you react to that, because the colonial discourse is saying Maghreb, and Maghreb in terms of demography, is fundamentally like Berber. And when we say Berber, it doesn't mean just Berbers. I mean, the Berber was identified as Aryan, as a matter of fact, as a primitive European. So there's a strong connection between the Berber in colonial discourse and the French or the Europeans in general, or the Aryan race. Because one of the definitions of the Berber is precisely that he's light skin, whereas the Arab is dark skin. Okay, so therefore, the Salafi responded to that. So Al-Maghreb al-Arabi, So it's a negative truth, but at the same time, it reproduces the very idea of the Maghreb. Only it reproduces negatively, whereas the colonial discourse says it's Berber, the Salafi discourse, it says it's Arab, okay? The national historian later on, as a matter of fact, a couple of decades or 3 decades later, did exactly the same. In 1960s, as a matter of fact, there was a very important book. It's called Decoloniser l'Histoire by Mohammed Sali. And what Mohammed Sali did was really something that people do today, you know, which is basically deconstruct the colonial discourse and try to show what it says when it says something, meaning, you know, the ideological presuppositions, assumptions of the discourse. That's very, very important in every critique, you know. Well, that enterprise of decolonization was pretty much aborted by the national historian, namely Abdullah Al-Alawi, who came and he said, no, that's not enough. We have to write our own history. So we have to come up with our own interpretation of what is the history of the Maghreb is. The first thing he does is that he reproduces the concept of Maghreb, l'histoire du Maghreb, that was published in 1970. And second, you know, despite the fact that he tries to kind of like minimize, if not maybe even eliminate like the concept of a phrase and replace it with the kind of like class concepts. But at the same time, when you look at the book, the entirety of the book is an argument, explicit, you know, against French authors, especially, you know, the most colonial of them all, Émile Félix Gautier. The only reason why, you know, we still hear about Gautier, it's because of Abdullah Al-Alawi. You know, otherwise, like, you know, that because like today that historian would be completely disqualified to talk about the history of the Maghreb. First of all, because he knew neither Arabic nor Berber. He relied almost entirely on the translation of Ibn Khaldun, l'histoire des Berbères, that was done by William de Slan. L'histoire des Berbères, the William de Slan, is not Ibn Khaldun. It's a colonial discourse. Ibn Khaldun could not possibly speak French. Ibn Khaldun could not possibly use the concept of race. Ibn Khaldun could not possibly, you know, understand Arabs and Berbers in terms of antagonism, okay, and so forth. Yeah, I read that there are other questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have 4 other questions that we'd like to get through. Could we perhaps have those questions posed and have a reply from you? Would you be comfortable with that, Prof?
Certainly.
I'm saying since we have 4 questions that we would like to get through, could these people ask the questions first and then you would respond to each of them consecutively?
So shall I read the question or?
We have questions in the chat. So can they ask their questions and then you respond to them all?
Yeah, of course.
Is that all right?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
wonderful. Thank you. Amina, you had a question, your hand was up.
Thank you, Mimi. Hi, Prof. So good to finally meet you, and thank you for honoring our invitation. My question pertains to the ways in which you constructed the book. So I browsed through, and I know that the first 3 chapters are about what you termed colonial knowledge, and then you move on to local knowledge. And I was really interested in the part where you speak about the complicity of local historians and ideologues in creating this colonial gaze or re-emphasizing the colonial gaze towards the Maghreb. And I was really interested if you could perhaps elaborate further on this point of the complicity of the local in...
Yeah. I should say that like the concept of complicity, you know, it's a little bit problematic, like many of the concepts that they use. Meaning it needs clarification. Complicity, again, it doesn't mean that like the national historian or the ulama got together with French and decided to be complicit about something. What it means is this, you know, and they say it really over and over again, like that we cannot underestimate how important the power of the colonial discourse is. Okay, and if you really want to have an idea how powerful that discourse is, in 2022, how many years after the French left Algeria? 70 years, 71 years. We're still talking about it, and most likely we'll still be talking about it for some time. So in its time, meaning if you were here, at the time the Yoti was ruling Morocco, or if you were in Algeria at the time the Arab were ruling Algeria, the discourse that they produced about the population was so important. It was so important because it has political repercussions on the entirety of the population, including on the individual himself. So therefore, that discourse, what it does is it creates discursive and political dynamics between itself and between those who engage in it. So that political dynamic makes it that no matter what the reaction of so-called native, he or she is going to concede in some ways to some of the categories, that came, with the discourse. So it's in that concession, and it's usually the concession. As I said, when I say concession, it means really like a position of accepting something because it's so powerfully true. So once you accept that, so you kind of accepted a good deal of the colonial representation about it. So it's in that sense. I don't know whether I used the word complicity. I doubt I used it, But if I used it, most likely it was a misuse of my part, What I meant was, again, it's a dynamic that makes it that the colonized, including the colonized ulama or the colonized national historian, feel when engaging a discourse of power that's backed by tremendously important, state with all kinds of technologies of power and colonial institutions and so forth, that you cannot, you cannot dismantle it as an individual. As a matter of fact, you cannot even dismantle it as a group. It is not a kind of desperate situation that there's we are doomed, there's nothing we can do. Just we should just accept what they say about us. It's not that. It's really what gave that discourse its power, which is basically it's a strong economic base. It needs to be faced with another strong economic base. The time when, Algerians, the Moroccans, the Tunisians, but it can also be the Kenyans, the Nigerians, the South Africans, when they're able to kind of produce really strong, important state institutions that can really kind of challenge, in a very, very, very important way, discourses about them. Then you can talk about sometimes. You can even talk about, but most likely, and they said that in the book, most likely that will give you something else. It will not put you in the position of you willing or wanting to kind of challenge the discourse. Most likely, you are going to be in a position to ignore it, because what we in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, etc., say about French today, it has no relevance whatsoever to the French. As a matter of fact, it did happen during the colonial period. You have a lot of writings about French, about colonialism, by the ulama, by also nationalists. The colonial state cared less about this discourse. As a matter of fact, they only spied on them because they started pretty much a little bit kind of subversive political activities, not really a scientific discourse that we need to listen to. Any other questions?
Thank you, Professor. We have other questions. Hicham, I see your hand, but could we first address the questions that came
yes.
previously in the chat?
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, I was saying, could I first go through the initial questions in the chat before we come to you?
Sure, yes.
Yeah, we had a question from Faisal, who says they can't ask the question now as they're in a cafe. And they said, my question for Prof is to what extent did pre-existing Arabic language texts and ideas of geography, in brackets Maghreb, Turab, Al-Baidan versus Bilad, Al-Sudan, etc., and race, be it whiteness, so-called Arabian Peninsula lineages, claimed supra-Saharan origins of Berbers, play in influencing how modern or French understandings came to be what they did. The question is there in the chat, Prof, if you'd like to refer to it. And another question following theirs is from Wangui. Before we get to Wangui, you're welcome to respond to Faisal.
You want me to answer the question?
You'd like the next question?
No, I mean, do you want me to answer the question that you just asked?
Yes, please, Prof.
Yeah.
Unless you want to, would you like us to ask all the questions first?
I would
Before
rather go question by question,
Okay.
because the questions that are asked, they are significant questions, and they try to be as brief as possible. But at the same time, it's a challenge because questions are really important, like this one that you just asked me. There was a whole, like, of course, I mean, there was significant, colossal historiography, about the region, by, Arabs, but also by others. But by Arabs, it was really, really important. I mean, like, we're not only thinking about the work of Ibn Khaldun, that was important, but we talk about Ibn Idari, Khairawani, we're talking about Idrisi, and so forth. So this work was really important for the French. When we look at the first stage of French cultural production in the region, the first thing that we see, especially with members of l'Exploration Scientifique d'Algérie, we see that there was a huge effort of translation. So they did rely on this knowledge a lot, in order to kind of comprehend the region. But again, that situation was really kind of complicated because translation, and they showed that, as a matter of fact, they showed that in the book, but they showed that in one of my articles about Ibn Khaldun Orientalists. But what they said about Ibn Khaldun, I mean, it's similar to other cases of translation from Arabic into French. And this is really the nature of translation itself. When you translate, because a language is not just a means of communication, a language has its categories of its own, A language is something so cultural, they're rooted in the culture. And therefore, when you translate a language to another language, what you really do is you try to interpret, and find equivalence from the original language to the language of translation. The language of translation, it's a world view by itself. And therefore you end up in the translation, kind of like creating a second text. Ibn Khaldun, as I said earlier, he would not recognize the history of the Berber, just like he wouldn't understand it, of course. But even if we teach him French, and then we ask him to read it, he would say, I didn't say that. So, and this is also like very, very important because like this local knowledge becomes colonial knowledge by sheer fact of translation to begin with, but also because of the colonial institutions that make the work important, etc., etc. So with a cartographer, with Arabic cartographer, especially Idrisi, the cartography has developed quite well from the 16th century to the 18th century, in the world, but also like in the region. In the region that was originally called Africa. You look at the map of 16th, 17th, even 18th century, and you find Africa is really the northern Africa minus Egypt. Why Egypt? Because the Greek decided long time ago that Egypt was part of Egypt. Herodotus said that. We cannot disagree with it. So even though if it's in Africa, because Herodotus said that, so let's make Egypt part of Egypt. So that was decided. The French did not challenge that, but also because the British, moved to Egypt, so they were not really interested in it anymore, or kind of entered in it like kind of abstractly, intellectually, but not really kind of economically, in terms of, colonial rule and exploitation and so forth. So the maps, again, like the French colonial maps, you find them, and they were quite very well developed. Africa itself till the 18th century was quite ignored. I mean, not ignored, it was quite ignored in the sense that it was not known. You look at the map, and most of Africa was pretty much blank space, with sometimes like, sentences that are not sentences, names, let's say, Pays des Noirs, country of blacks, or Pays des Nègres, countries of Negroes. Sometimes there was another name. The entirety of the rest of Africa was called Nigritit, but the so-called Maghreb or North Africa, we really they were more known. I mean, you find cities and you find like, the names of, there were different names, like you have État de Fès, État d'Alger, État de Tripoli, État de Tunis. And sometimes you find the part of the Ottoman Empire, with the exception of Morocco, that's called l'Empire Chérifien, du Maroc, and so forth. So again, despite the fact that this knowledge was known, it was converted, it was made colonial, to really signify something that its original authors did not really have in mind. Again, with cartography, with technologies of power, by 19th century, the French would really know the entirety of the continent, as a matter of fact, the entirety of the world itself. By 1950s, you have very exact maps that were done by jets, by aviation, So that's basically it. Yeah, next question, please.
Thank you, Prof. I'd like to mention that we have reached 5 o'clock, or 5:03 rather, but we still haven't gone through some questions. Sorry for keeping you all waiting in the session. We have couple more questions. One is from Wangui. Wangui, would you like to pose your question? We will maybe extend the book launch for another 15 to 20 minutes for the purposes of this engagement.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Mimi. My question is, I think, basically, in Kiswahili, the word Africa Magharibi describes West Africa, but in some sense, it appears from my very layman eyes to have a connection to Maghreb. And so my question is whether, so Africa Magharibi captures what we refer to as West Africa, and then Africa Kaskazini, North Africa, captures most of what we consider the Maghreb. And so I was wondering whether this multiplicity of the Maghreb indicates a non-consensus on what the Maghreb is, or maybe it indicates multiple understandings of geographies, which I think you're gesturing towards in your book, which I haven't read, but that Magharibi in Swahili is capturing West Africa, but it seems related to Maghreb. And so my very basic question was whether you see a relation between Maghreb and Magharibi, and if so, how do we account for the differences in geographies that are captured by those two terms? And perhaps these differences also indicates this lack of consensus or this consistent invention that you're talking about. I hope that's clear. Thank you.
Well, first of all, what I don't know is the origin of the names, where are they coming from? Are they local names? And it's possible that they are because of the connection between so-called Maghreb and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. It's possible. But in my book, what I have, while doing my research, what I have noticed was the so-called Maghreb was defined in relation, and I would even say not only in relation, but also against two other conceptions. When I say against, meaning it's not only it's different, but it's something that cannot possibly be combined with the other entity. And first one is West Africa, that were also French. It was also defined, as I said earlier, when I just started talking about this, against, and not only in relation to so-called Middle East, a term that came into being in 1916. Okay, so East Africa, because like many of it was really kind of part of the British Empire, but the French were not concerned by that part, because they were concerned by the parts that surround the region that we call Maghreb, whether it's the Middle East or West Africa. Of course, there's always like a good exercise on the matter of fact to see what the region is called in the rest of the world, as you just said, like in East Africa. But then we have to find out, where are these concepts coming from? Because concepts are not just born out of nothing. They come from, specific like location, because names are not just names, they are indexes behind which you find conceptions, So what you just said, like these names, they must have a history. They must have coming from somewhere. That history that they don't know because they didn't work on that part of Africa. But also, they said they have conception behind it. Like how that area that's called Maghreb in that name, how it's conceived. What ideas do people who use that term have about that region? What you said can be applied again to, I don't know, I was always surprised that in Iran, for instance, they have different names to the region, and they're completely different names to Morocco. They call Morocco Marrakech, not Morocco, which is a name that's completely unknown to them, So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Professor. Oh, my apologies, I was on mute. I was saying thank you so much, Prof, for that response. And we have one more question from Nadi. Nadi, are you able to ask your question in person?
Yes,
Or
I
would you
am.
like? Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the organizer. My question is actually, I have to first admit that my knowledge is more with the Mashriq, with the East, not really with the Maghreb. But my question is inspired by 3 visits that I did to Morocco with my students, and the conversation that I had with various intellectuals in Morocco. So I wanted your opinion about all these terms that you discussed, whether they're in the a product of the French colonialism or the Arabic Muslim discussion of how do we describe this area versus the new terms that are being imposed on that part of the world, the Middle East or the greater Middle East. So how is this played in among intellectuals in Morocco today, as well as common people? And if there are differences of opinions based on whether you are a Moroccan from Arab descent or a Moroccan from Amazigh descent. Thank you.
I'm not sure really I understood your question, but I think I can guess. I do have problems with the last sentence you said, because most of Moroccans don't know whether they are from Arab descent or Berber descent. Most of them don't. And even those who do, they may be mistaken because we don't know. And when by saying what you just said, you reproduce like another colonial category that really sees the population as Arabs, versus Berbers. Whereas the situation is much, much complex than that. In the sense that we don't know. Like in the 8th century, we don't know who came here. Like even the so-called Arab army, which was made like heavily of Persians, who are themselves quite diverse as a matter of fact. They are not just like this idea of Persians that the Iranians have today about themselves. But you mentioned like, the perceptions of the intellectuals. Well, I mean, the concept of intellectual itself has become really problematic. It made sense up to maybe 1960. You can talk about intellectual, and it has a specific definition. It's someone highly political. Usually it's someone from the left, whatever that left was. It could be like socialism, it could be communism. And it's someone that like defines himself in a specific relation, usually antagonistic relationship towards states, that he or she opposes. That concept of interaction is distinct now. I mean, we don't have it now. What we really have, we have professors, we have professors of history, professors of anthropology, professors of sociology, and so forth. So if you're asking me like the question, what do professors think about like this representation that they just mentioned and that they said, it made up the Maghreb as we know today? I don't know which professors. Usually, like if it's sociologists, usually sociologists, they have a little bit of indifference to history, unless the sociologist is doing historical sociology. In that case, it will be different, So I would say that like for the historians, let's say, at least like the historians that I know, and many of them I know even personally, many of the stuff that they said would come as self-evident, really. I mean, like the idea that the Maghreb is invented, they will find that self-evident. And they said it at the beginning of the talk, I said it's self-evident. With the argument of the book is self-evident. It's the demonstration that's complex. But to have a self-evident idea with a complex demonstration is not a small thing, after all, like physics changed because someone's argued self-sample, which is basically like that objects fall from up to down, not the other way around, But the demonstration of that very simple idea, revealed itself to be very, very important. So again, like the historians that that I would know, I mean, whether historians of modern times or historians of medieval times, especially as a matter of fact, historians of medieval times, they have that conception of longue durée. You could see like that the Maghreb that they study and they talk about in the work of Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Idari or Al-Qayrawani is not the Maghreb that people refer to today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very engaging discussion, and thank you to all who posed questions. Thank you, Nabil, for your intervention. If you have anything to add, please, you're welcome to add anything else. Otherwise, we're happy to conclude.
No additions. Yeah, we have someone who's raising her hand, Hisham.
Hicham.
Yeah, I just wanted
Hicham.
to have a yes.
I'm so sorry I
okay.
overlooked your question. Please kindly ask your question.
No problem.
Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question for our professor. So first of all, thank you so much for your presentation of your book. It's so intriguing to know all this colonial history that has shaped the area of the Maghreb and Africa in general. So my question to you is about decolonization, and we know that especially here in the modern nation, in the post-colonial modern nation, this binarism, this binary structure, it still exists. It was inherited
between what and what?
Okay, so this binarism, like you said, between Arabs and Berbers or Amazigh, and between East and West as two powers that were involved in the colonial history. So we have this, history of colonialism after another. So the Arabs, of course, have colonized the Amazigh, and also like Arabs and Muslims, and then we have this colonial history of Europe that colonized that area. So we have, you know, like layers and layers of histories and colonialisms. So as scholars now, how can we address decolonization in places like Morocco? Because it really, like I see it in the everyday life, like when I listen to, for example, you know, to some political leaders in the parliament, for example, how they speak about, you know, Morocco, and if, you know, the question of identity is brought up, and they talk about it as if it's really strongly tied with classical Arabic and Islam, with, you know, complete disregard of, you know, any other communities, whether ethnic, racial, cultural, linguistic, or whatever they are, religious. There is a, you know, like a total disregard of these communities, and that's the official discourse that, you know, they circulate and that people see and hear in Morocco, for example. So how, as scholars, can we, you know, address this decolonization issue?
So this is a very complex question. First of all, the first thing to do, you know, I think not only for a scholar, but like for an educated person, is to be able to, and that's what really education is about, you know, to be able to, you know, to think for oneself and to critique even the most self-evident truth that may be out there. For scholars, they have like an extra responsibility in that not only they have to do that, but they also have, like, you know, to communicate, you know, this critical thinking, you know, to not only to their kind of like the community of scholars, you know, but to go beyond that, you know, and communicate with the larger public, you know, through I don't know, through television, through the mass media, social media, through journalism and press and so forth, you know. So that's what like, you know, I mean, on an individual level, that's what it should be done. But I really believe like the you know, the most effective work that can be really done, it needs to be done at the state level. When I say state level, it means state institution, meaning like the university, you know, the university in this country or in Nigeria or in Tunisia, you know, should be aware of what its responsibility is. And its first responsibility is precisely the production of knowledge. And of course, the production of knowledge is a very, very complex process, you know.
It is, yes.
Repeating someone else's knowledge, you know, you are not producing knowledge. Let me just say this, you know, at the risk of, you know, appearing controversial or polemical. If you send your students to France and you come back, you know, and you work at your university, and you are not really producing your knowledge. And the production of knowledge also means the production of scholars, you know, from within your lab, you know, from within your institution. And that's what I said earlier. One of the challenges, you know, to the, you know, that colonial discourse imposes on the post-colonized, which is basically us today, is precisely the fact that, like, you know, it's very, very difficult to dismantle, even with the most sophisticated, like, ideas, tools that we have today, like semiotics, anthropology, and so forth. Even with that, what needs to be done is, like, you need to have like an infrastructure of research, you know, that produce, like, you know, scholars, like, you know, worthy of the name of scholars, not just someone who teaches, you know, and even to teach is very, very important, like, you know, at the university. And then, of course, I mean, reproduce knowledge itself, you know, and it's very, very important to be connected to the world. I wouldn't be doing this type of work, honestly, if I didn't go to the United States, you know.
I would assume so.
I could not do it in France. It's virtually impossible. I mean, like,
impossible. Yeah,
impossible to do it in France. So that's basically what.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I totally agree with you, because earlier I think maybe the term conspiracy, just, you know, somebody spoke about conspiracy, and you said maybe that was
She said complicity. She said
complicity. Yeah,
because-
complicity, or, but I see it in the sense of, you know, conspiracy between,
No,
you know,
but
like, you know.
You can be complicit with something against your own will, but also you can be complicit out of ignorance that
Of course, yes.
what
Yeah,
you are getting yourself into, you know, and
that's right. Yeah.
but you don't know what the repercussions of your, you know, complicity is, you know,
That's right.
to others, you know.
But at least I see this relationship of, you know, complicity between perhaps the, you know, the colonial state and, you know, the post-colonial, you know, nation, and how it established itself as a nation that tries to, you know, to contain the populations and contain their identities in order to, you know, just form one population. Of course, it was done for, you know, purposes of, you know, gaining, you know, independence from the colonizer. But afterwards, this discourse, you know, it just kind of kept repeating itself and repeating itself. I mean, it's not what we see, for example, in Frantz Fanon, like this notion of nationalism or national consciousness, which is used as an instrument to, you know, fight colonialism. But it's something that outlasted colonialism, and now the post-colonial nation is exercising colonialism on its populations, if I may say so. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor, for your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Hicham. Thank you, Professor. Nabil, do you have any closing comments before we conclude?
Yeah, I just want to thank Professor Hannoum and participants who joined us from different parts, and including Moroccans actually. So much thoughts actually to process. And I want to thank you, and also I want to draw attention to Mimi's comment in the chat box, like if you want to follow Huma social handles, where you can follow Huma seminars about scholars working in and on from Africa. Like you can just follow the social handles of Huma, and also if you want to check the archival works and seminars in the YouTube channel and also Facebook streamings. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thanks for pointing that out, Nabil. I was going to invite everyone to our next seminar series. This is not the only series we have. We have the African Epistemology Advanced Seminar Series. We also have a book, it's a book lunch and a book launch series that all happen on Monday afternoon. We have a range of other series, a doctoral seminar series, all of which are listed on our calendar. Please check out our calendar and our social media for those updates. On Friday, we have Dr. Motsamai Molefe, who will be speaking in a philosophy lunchtime seminar. We don't normally have a Friday seminar, but they will be there speaking on ethics of personhood and bioethics. Please make a note of that session. And our next book launch will be next Monday by Noor Naga. And following that on the 1st of September is the Huma Interdisciplinary Seminar Series. This was the Huma book launch series with Professor Hannoum. Thank you so much for sharing your book. If you would like to see the archived version of this video, it's on our YouTube. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.